presentations. I can say that after a very interesting trip to the North Africa, we are coming back to Oman and to Zanzibar. So that sounds extremely interesting. There are three speakers in our session. The first speaker is Professor Valerie Hoffman from the University of Illinois and well-known editor of the literature on Ibadah. So the title of the presentation of Professor Hoffman is Political Geography and Ibadi Thought in Modern Oman and Zanzibar. So please, Professor Hoffman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. So this is a huge topic, but I'm so pleased that there have been other papers that have dealt with some of the things I want to deal with here. The conference that discusses Ibadi identity in relation to both local and global contexts, I think invites reflection on the intersection of religion, culture, and global politics and geography. So people have, of course, theorized for centuries about the impact of geography on culture, and the discipline known as political geography analyzes, tries to find explanations for differences in political and cultural development. It arose, of course, at first in the late 19th century as a way of analyzing the nation state, seeing it as influenced sort of from above by geopolitics and then from below by local conditions. So I'm going to adapt this type of analysis by looking at Ibadi thought. And of course, all religions, even though religious traditions are supposed to have an eternal message, they nonetheless, there are aspects, as we know, that do change. And so I'm going to be looking at, as best I can, the extent to which Ibadi thought in Oman and Zanzibar in the modern period has been affected by global politics and trends on the one hand and local context on the other. So some of the ways that Ibadi thought has changed that I will try to address in this paper. First of all, attitudes toward the necessity of establishing an imamate, which is of course an imperative in the classical tradition. Secondly, attitudes toward the necessity of preserving certain traditional customs that have been linked to Ibadism in the past. And third, attitudes toward the exclusive legitimacy of Ibadism among the various schools of Islam. So to begin, of course, with the imamate. I actually made a PowerPoint partly because I thought maybe there would be Japanese students here who wouldn't know much about Ibadism and the topic would be strange. But I see that actually I'm talking to a specialized audience for the most part. So I will probably then skip over things that are unnecessary, which is great. So we just heard about how in North Africa, of course, after the defeat of the Rustamid dynasty by the Fatimids, they, rather than having an imam, they had the institution of the azaba. But in Oman, no such institution evolved, and the imamate remained a theoretical imperative for quite some time, though in practice it hasn't always existed. But if you look at the histories of Ibn Muzayq and especially Salami, you see that Salami especially really regarded the imamate as the imperative, and his history of Oman revolves around the rise and fall of the imamate. So what I am interested in what are the conditions that prompted the rise of imamate movements in Oman's modern history, beginning with the Ya'rabi imamate, but with a particular focus on the imamate movements of the 19th and early 20th century. So, oops, that doesn't seem right. Rise of, I thought, I'm out of order here. Okay, that's fine. So, I just want to see something. All right, so here we have, of course, the imamate, the Ya'rabi imamate was revived The Imamate survived after a long hiatus in 1624 with the selection of Nasir ibn Murshid al-Ya'rubi as imam. Now, if you look at what Salami and Ibn Ruzayn have to say about this, they simply say, well, after many years of bloodshed, injustices, and political division, the people decided to demand a righteous imamate. Well, these are all valid factors, but bloodshed, injustice, and political division is pervasive at all times and places, and so you have to ask the question, why now? Why was there an imamate at that particular time? And so I'm missing my slide. I don't know where it went, but that's okay. One of the things that I want to look at, what is the impact of European intrusion? Because one could say that the rise of an imamate would require a number of things. One, it would require, of course, the sorts of grievances that Salami was talking about. Secondly, it would require the aspiration or desire to have an imamate, and it would require opportunity, and it would require leadership. So you have to have all of these factors in place. But I want to look also at the factor of European intrusion. Now, you can't say that the Ya'rubi dynasty was prompted by the presence of the Portuguese, even though the Portuguese were there, because the Portuguese entered the area a whole century before the founding of the Ya'rubi dynasty. But one of the things that is, I think, of interest is that there's plenty of evidence that even indirect European presences have prompted various movements. So this is where things got out of order, but this is some examples of well-known pre-modernist movements that arose, reform movements, a sense that there is a crisis, something is wrong, we need to have moral reform, we need to have political revitalization, and in none of these cases were they directly caused by European presence, but I believe indirectly they were. Because they're all a response to economic decline, a sense that something has gone wrong. Now, their diagnosis is that the problem is religious. And so I would say, well, what is it then that prompted the Ya'rubi imamate? And what happened is that it was the introduction of the East India Company into the region, and their alliance with Shah Abbas. They drove the Portuguese out of Bandar Abbas in 1622, and suddenly this sort of was an advertisement that the Portuguese are weak. It prompted many other efforts to get rid of the Portuguese. So this was one particular thing, and so beginning in Rostov and conquering the cities one by one in the interior, then going down to the coast, Nasir ibn Murshid's forces attacked those whom Salami calls the Christians, but meaning the Portuguese, and indeed succeeded in limiting them, not expelling them entirely, but his successor did. So by 1650, the Portuguese were out of Oman. Now, and then of course we, I don't know what happened to some of my slides. They seem to be missing, so that's okay. We will manage. I will just say one thing. Salami, illustrates, I think, the typical sort of paradigm of how to write history if you consider the imamate absolutely important. Divinely powered victory of the righteous over tyranny leads to not only religious and moral rejuvenation, but economic rejuvenation. Suddenly you've got good crops, you've got low prices, whereas the rule of tyrants leads not only to injustice and bloodshed, but to drought and economic depression. And so the question I have is, what happens to this religious perspective when the struggle against the infidel or the tyrant has been accomplished and the ruler becomes preoccupied with the need to constantly reassert his power, and the imamate becomes a great maritime commercial empire, which is what happened under both the Ya'rubis and the Busa'idis. So, and the reason, of course, that I have Sahar there is Sahar is the city that Ahmed bin Sa'id was the governor of, and he got rid of the Persians. So again, external powers prompting a new rise in leadership. So, in the Busaidi period, one of the things that's really interesting reading Salome's text is how many uprisings there were. Now, most of them didn't get very far, but there were lots of them. So that immediately after Imam Ahmed's death, his son Said was found to be wanting, and very soon his own son and his brothers were seizing actual power in Oman. So his rivals didn't claim the title of Imam, but they were referred to simply as Sayyid. And one of these uprisings was led by Abu Nabhan, a great scholar of the time, who, and I think this is one of the characteristics of many of these uprisings, and this is one of the things that first really fascinated me when I got to know Ibn Zayed Oman, is how the role of ulama in leading uprisings against the rulers. Now, most historians say that Said bin Sultan was the greatest of the Busaidi rulers. Nonetheless, there were plenty of rebellions against him, and there were certain grievances. What prompted this? One was there were new Wahhabi incursions into Oman and other areas of the Persian Gulf. He needed to ally himself with the British in order to get their help to repel them, and they forced him to make concessions to stop the slave trade, to try to stop arms trafficking, which of course was a threat to the way things were and to the economy of Oman. A lot of people deeply resented this. So one of the things that one of my colleagues at the University of Illinois, I gave a talk in which I told this story about how Sheikh Abu Nabhan used his talismanic skills, al-Nasir, to bring the forces of Muhammad Ali Pasha from Egypt to defeat the Wahhabis. And one of my colleagues said, this looks like the secret history of the 19th century. He really enjoyed that. So, whether or not, of course, we would credit Abu Nabhan with bringing about Muhammad Ali Pasha's expedition, many Omanis have believed in the ability of people, of spiritual people, extraordinarily spiritual people, to work miracles. And so Salome depicts the leading religious scholars as defenders of the oppressed and leaders of rebellions, and in times of distress, people turn to them to make things right. And so there was a constant conflict between the conservative Ibadis and Sayyid Said's rule. Now, of course, Muhammad Salome, the son of Nuruddin Salome, who continued his father's history of Oman, talks about how this is an eternal struggle between monarchy and imamate. And you see the quote there, they desire different things, and they are built on different foundations. The government of the Imam is built on consultation, the election of a just Imam, conformity to the Sharia, unlike monarchs and tyrants. So he considers this to be a foundational struggle. So this raises the question, well, how then are scholars going to relate to the rulers? Does this mean they're just going to withdraw altogether? Well, no, that isn't the way it works. In fact, they often did become important counselors to rulers, and many of them lived on the largesse of the rulers. So is it permissible to accept gifts from tyrants? And actually, I remember in Walid's paper, he raised this as an issue, and I found it interesting because what I have found, at least in like Qamus al-Sharia, is the opposite, that yes, it's totally permissible. And they cite all sorts of precedents. They say Ibn Abbas received gifts from Muawiyah, Jabir ibn Zayd received an annual stipend from Al-Hajjaj, Abu Huraira had been in Ali's entourage, but he decided to go for Muawiyah because he said, his morsel is fatter. If you can give me, I love that saying. So therefore, it is considered permissible as long as one is certain that the property is wrongfully acquired. Well, I don't know how one can know that, especially if you're talking about a tyrant, but nonetheless, it was allowed to do it. So how is one to interact with somebody whom you regard as a tyrant? And I think in this regard, the story of the relationship between Sheikh Said bin Sultan and Sayyid Said bin Sultan and Sheikh Nasser ibn Abi Nabhan is quite instructive. So according to Nuruddin Salami, Sayyid Said hated Abu Nabhan and his family, but didn't dare do anything against them because he was so afraid of Abu Nabhan. After all, he was able to bring the Egyptian army. You never know what's going to happen. So he waited until Abu Nabhan died in 1822, and then he was deceptively kind to Nasser, his son, who was the next great sheikh, and got him to write a talisman that would protect him against all other talismans. And so Nasser did so. And then, having that talisman to protect him, he launched an all-out attack on the family fortress, besieged them, starved them, defeated them, etc. So Nasser's brother said, please do something. And he says, well, what can I do? I wrote this talisman for him. And so he said, okay, I'll try, but it's going to take a long time. And so he does secret work. It took a year and a half of constant recitation of formulas, but finally it worked. Sayyid Said started to experience defeats. Sayyid Said knew it was not his fault. He got really scared, so what did he do? He did what any smart ruler would do. You may keep your friends close, but you keep your enemies closer, right? So he took Nasser into his inner circle, and Salami says he took him everywhere he went, into battle, when he moved to Zanzibar, because of course he moved the capital to Zanzibar in 1832, and he just went everywhere. Well, how did Nasser look at this? Was this a triumph or something repulsive to suddenly be in the inner circle of someone you regard as a tyrant? And perhaps we can learn something of his attitude from Salami's statement that Sheikh Nasser was rude and harsh with Sayyid Said and his companions, rebuking them to their faces, while they were soft with him and did nothing to displease him out of fear that he would work some divine secret against them for which he was famous. So, and I also found it interesting that in reading a different, much more recent account of the history of Zanzibar, this guy was telling where all the great scholars lived, and he said they all, this one lived in this house. He said, but Sheikh Nasser lived in the palace with the Sultan. And I thought, whoa, that is quite interesting too. So, as I already mentioned the grievances that prompted the uprisings during the reign of Sayyid Said. And I just think that it's important to see that they come from lots of different directions. And so after Said's death, when he died in 1856, British interference became much more pronounced, to the point, of course, as we know, of forcing the division of the Omani Empire between Oman and Zanzibar. So Oman was under Sayyid Thuwaini, who's on the right, and Zanzibar was under Sayyid Majid, who's on the left in this picture. Now, Thuwaini claimed the right to rule Zanzibar and tried to take it by force. He was coming over in a fleet. Some of them had already come. Witness accounts say all was chaos and excitement, and hundreds of people came just to see if they could take part in what was going to happen. And ultimately, the British stopped Thuwaini en route and said, no way, we're not going to let this happen. And so this, of course, ultimately led in 1861 to the so-called Canning Award, which formally separated Oman from Zanzibar. In the meantime, however, there was in 1859 Sayyid Barbash, a younger brother's, rebellion against Majid. Majid was seen as kind of a soft person, very compliant with the British. Barbash hated the British. And he also had a very close alliance with members of the Harathi tribe, and who were, sort of notorious in both Oman and Zanzibar for their rebellions against the government. So, and also his sisters. And so I pictured the famous Sayyida Salma, who we all know and love. And so, but the real question is, what was this uprising all about? So some have said, oh, he just wanted to be the ruler. Some have said he was acting on behalf of Khomeini, but I think that we might perhaps find it instructive to note that later when he became Sultan of Zanzibar, he really was he was really well known for his ardent adherence to Ibadism, his publication of Ibadi sources, his punishment of Ibadi converts to Sunni Islam. And he was in a very delicate position because he had to ally himself with the British and with the conservative Ibadis. Now, there's this very famous picture, many of you have seen, I know, of Sayyid Barghash and his advisors. Now, what I would like to know, and if anyone in this audience can enlighten me, please do. Sir Reginald Copeland, in his book about East Africa and its invaders, calls Barghash's conservative Ibadi entourage Mlawas. What is this word? I've asked for people who know Swahili, they don't know. And so, anyway, I would love to know. But it's very clear who they are because he says their patron was Imam Azan ibn Qais al-Sa'idi, who of course was put into power as a result of the most spectacular Imamate movement of all, the very successful revolution in 1868. So, okay. So, as you may know, Sayyid Khomeini, you see, I revised this. It didn't say in my revision. Now I see. I made it a simpler slide without so many words. I apologize. But anyway, Sayyid Khomeini was murdered by his son Salim, who was favored by the Wahhabis. And so even though Salim tried to convince the conservative Ibadis, I did it for justice and all of this, ultimately, there was this very famous rebellion with Saleh ibn Ali al-Harfi, who had been one of Barghash's co-conspirators in Zanzibar, now leading with Sheikh Said bin Khalfan al-Khalili and Azan ibn Qais. They successfully overthrew Sultan Salim and they put Imam Azan into power. So the question is, what made this rebellion fall? So one of the things is tribal divisions, the Hana'is versus the Qataris. The association of the conservatives with the Hana'is was always an issue. Another thing is that Sayyid Majid, who was ruler of Zanzibar when Azan became imam, refused to send the Zanzibar subsidy, which was part of the Canning Award. Zanzibar was wealthier, they were supposed to send the money every year to Oman, and he refused. The British didn't like the imam because they considered them fanatics, right? And so they said, oh, that's fine with us. Let's, impoverish them. And Majid not only didn't pay them, and so therefore caused economic problems, which led them to have to impose new taxes, which happened not to be popular, but also Majid paid large sums to his brother Turki, who had been exiled to Bombay for being a troublemaker before by the British. The British now said, okay, you can come back, Turki. And so Turki allied with the Wahhabis and with British sort of, being complicit and overthrew the imam. Now, one of the things, though, which is of interest to me is that some of the British reporters there said people on the coast really resented the strictures of the imam's forces. That they wouldn't let them smoke. They're going around, trying to force people to enforce obedience. Just like you've got the morality police in Saudi Arabia, that's what was happening with the imamate. And so people didn't like that. They were saying, that might have been okay in the interior. It didn't go over well on the coast. So afterwards, of course, Saleh ibn Ali al-Harfi, who's the sole survivor of the three leaders, continued to harass Muscat, attacked it repeatedly, even captured it once, until the British finally said, no, you can't do that anymore. The Sultan paid him off. Not going to get into all of that, but obviously we all know that the next really big Imamate revolt was in 1913, led by Nuruddin Salmi. Now the interesting thing about this is that Sultan Faisal hated the British, and he initially wanted to be an imam and to ally himself with Salami and the conservative forces. And so what he did was to make a pact with the French. Oh, British don't like it when you make a pact with the French, right? So they humiliated him publicly and forced him to back down. And so this made Salami and his cohorts furious with Sultan Faisal. And so Faisal got angry with Salami and issued a death threat against him. And so ultimately, Salami and his forces were trying to oust Faisal. They didn't succeed in doing that, but as you know, they succeeded in establishing an imamate in the interior. So you're probably familiar, of course, with the fact that the imamate was established in the Jabal al-Akhdar region and in Sharqiya. So in any case, the same year as the imamate partially succeeded, Sultan Faisal died. He was succeeded by Timur, and who was actually a friend of Salih ibn Ali al-Harbi's son, Isa, who wanted to mediate a peace between the Sultanate and the Imamate. This was not possible under Imam Salim, but when he died, his successor, Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Khalili, agreed. And so the division of Oman between Oman, meaning the dominion of the Imam, and Muscat, meaning the dominion of the Sultan, was formalized by the British officiated Treaty of Sea, and remained in effect until, of course, in December 1955, with British military support, motivated by the desire to drill for oil. Sultan Said bin Timur reunited Oman under his rule. So most of the Imamate rebellions did not succeed. Those that did were initiated by revered religious scholars who recruited competent tribal leaders as military commanders. Let's see. Oh, I had such a great PowerPoint. I clearly didn't save. I'm so sorry. So I'm missing some things, but that's okay. I had a slide in which I put under some of the factors, but I think we pretty much covered them. So what I'm going to just talk a bit about is what is the impact of the maritime culture on Ibanti cultural attitudes. The early political geography tended toward environmental determinism, which has been pretty much discredited now. However, it is a matter of common sense that geographic isolation, as we see in the interior of Oman, encourages the formation of bounded communities that tend to distrust those who are different, whereas communities with diverse populations that engage in commerce, across broad geographic expanses, are more likely to be accepting of others. And so this has certainly been observed in Oman. Now, the dislocation of the seat of power from Oman's interior to the coast, which occurred during the Imamate of Said ibn Ahmed and continued under Husaidi rule, was more than symbolic. The Zanzibari scholar Abd Sharif, I don't know if any of you, did you know Abd Sharif? Yeah, very, very nice person. In an article in this particular book that he co-edited with Aung San Ho, he notes that geographers in the ancient times believed the Indian Ocean was an inland sea, a kind of Mediterranean. And he cites the French historian Michel Mola as saying that these inland seas, which included the Indian Ocean, have always been centers of civilization, zones of encounters across cultures. So, and I don't have time really to get into it, but I cite some other thinkers, Fernand Braudel on the Mediterranean, Chaudhuri on the Indian Ocean as a unity, Michael Pearson, who argued that intergroup economic cooperation in littoral, meaning coastal societies, promotes a sort of homogenization. So the impact of geography on culture, combined with maritime trade, has fascinated many scholars. And so perhaps this might help us to explore the implications of the Ya'rabi and Busaidi dynasties' embrace of mercantile culture and creation of a vast Indian Ocean empire. So, as we know, the center of scholarship in Oman was the interior, the Jabal al-Akhdar region. And we also know that during the reign of Sayyid Said, the Empire of Oman included the Swahili coast, all the way from what is southern Somalia down to northern Mozambique, and parts of Iran, India, and what are today the United Arab Emirates. So now, in Zanzibar, the Ibadis were a minority. They were privileged, but they were a minority. They interacted a lot with Sunni scholars and occasionally Shi'i scholars, but definitely Sunni scholars who were the majority. And when Barabas came to power, as I said, he actually had to cooperate quite closely with the British, and while at the same time having this relationship with very conservative Ibadism. And he also allowed Christian missions quite a lot of leeway. He is the one who allowed the building of that enormous Anglican cathedral in what used to be the slave market. Now, some Ibadis in Zanzibar, as you may know, were hesitant about the legitimacy of some of the new practices that were coming in, and they wrote to Nuruddin Salami, and he wrote about this in a manuscript which has been published, a manuscript Badl al-Majhud fi Mukhallafat al-Nasara wal-Yahud, written in January 1910, records some of this correspondence. So they were saying, look, we have these schools with European teachers. Is it okay to send our kids there? Is it okay if we adopt certain things of European clothing, like a jacket over our robes? Is it all right if we learn European languages? Is it all right to shave or trim the beard? And of course, Salami goes, no, 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 no. And so what I think is interesting is that while, his wording is delightful. He talks about, of course, about how foolish you are. Don't you know they're trying to convert you and your children by going to school? Don't you know that if you speak their languages, you're going to use their specious reasoning and your hearts will be led into deception? And don't you know that, Hindus never adopted Arab clothing for all the centuries they were living among Arabs? Why would you wonderful people, the Arabs, with your dignified, elegant clothing and your fine heritage, ever want to imitate anybody else? And of course, shaving or trimming the beard, absolutely out of the question. And it's interesting because on many of these points, he encountered pushback from the Zanzibaris, but not on the beard issue. To shave or trim the beard was considered a mark of having abandoned Islam. And I think it's interesting because, of course, today, many very pious Ibadis at least trim the beard, right? And we have some of them among us. So, and I talked to one such person who was a very conservative Ibadi, and I asked him about this. Is this not a problem that you trim your beard? He goes, we're So, so it's clear that attitudes do indeed change. And one of the fascinating people that Amal has written quite a lot about, and I don't have time to go into him, is Abu Musal al-Bahlani. And there are seeming contradictions in his life. On the one hand, he was a really enthusiastic supporter of Nuruddin Salami's Imamate movement, considered himself the official poet of that movement, but he was also, co-editor of the first Arabic newspaper in Zanzibar, which had very reformist attitudes along the lines of Muhammad Abdu, and he also was a very close confidant of some of the sultans. And in his account of the journey of Sayyid Sultan Hamoud along the coast, he talks about the good things the British have done, even though there's lots of other testimony that indicates he hates the British. Well, he probably wrote this account for the Sultan, and he was limited in what he could do. But I would also like to suggest that these apparent contradictions are also because, as Mariana said in her talk, we all have multiple identities, and so we can kind of maintain them, but ultimately they may clash. So what happens then when there is constant contact between Ibadis and Sunnis in particular? And I think, of course, the obvious thing is there has been a marked decline in Ibadi exclusivism, to the point that most Ibadis that I have encountered in Oman have no idea that until, fairly recently, if you look at the longue durée, that Ibadis considered only pious Ibadis to be Muslims and believers, right? This is completely unknown to the vast majority of Ibadis I have met in Oman. So when you interact a lot, what is the impact? You start, of course, seeing that there is a lot in common. You start respecting their spirituality. Ibadi scholars in Zanzibar developed quite a close relationship with the Salafia movement in Egypt. And so what does this, and of course Sheikh Ali ibn Muhammad al-Mundari, one of the great Ibadi scholars in the early 20th century in Zanzibar, knew English so well that in his refutation of a 10th century, 9th century Nestorian text, he consulted 4 different English translations of the Bible, just to make sure he got it all right. So I thought that was really quite interesting. And of course, the wearing of European clothes became so common that Sultan Ali bin Mahmud wore them all the time, and eventually he gave up being Sultan and moved to Europe and lived there. So, so clearly things were changing. Well, what does that do then? How does this impact Ibadi exclusivism and attitudes toward Walaya and Bara'a? And so the doctrine of dissociation, of course, also lends itself to a policy of non-cooperation with the government of Zanzibar when the British made it a protectorate in 1890. For a long time, I was trying to figure out what does it mean in practice to dissociate from somebody. So I found it interesting that Abu Muslim al-Bahlani, in his book Al-Aqidah al-Wahidiyya, his creed, it says, where the hypothetical student asks the teacher, you know, what happens if a non-Ibadi is nice to me and I start liking him? And Bahlani says, no problem, it's fine. You can like him, you can be nice to him. You can even love him. After all, you're allowed to marry a non-Ibadi, right? You can love a non-Ibadi, just as long as it doesn't go to the extent of feeling that you have religious affiliation with him. So I thought that was rather interesting because, of course, it's quite different from expulsion from the community and complete dissociation. Now, when I went to Oman, I visited, and I had a picture in my revised PowerPoint, which has disappeared, of Sheikh Salim ibn Hamad al-Harthi, who was a judge in Mudayrib, in the interior, or in Sharqiya, and he was quite conservative, sort of the Nuruddin Salami school. And I met with him and asked him, do Ibadis dissociate from Sunnis? And he said, yes. Then I met with the Mufti, Sheikh Ahmed Khalili, and I asked him the same question, and he said, no. And he said, the differences between Ibadism and Sunnism are too insignificant to matter. And I said to him, well, I read this fatwa by Abu Nabhan where someone said, what is the status in the afterlife of this Sunni, who you know, is so devout, prays all the time, is ascetic, is wonderful in every way. What happens in the afterlife? Abu Nabhan says, hellfire, that's it, you know? And so when I started saying to the Mufti, I read this fatwa by Abu Nabhan, and there were a whole bunch of people in the room, and he kind of went, I know. You know, like, we're not going to talk about that. Things have changed too much. We think differently about things now. So obviously, in the period of Sultan Qaboos, there have been so many rapid changes, and the government, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, doesn't even allow sectarian preaching and teachings in the school. And so many Ibadis today no longer know what makes them different from other Muslims other than the position of their hands, right, in prayer. So, and Oman has also promoted, you might recognize this, Abdurrahman, I don't know if you recognize this journal, it's Tafahum, but you know, there's definitely, they promoted the idea of Ibadism as a moderate sect. I know this was a Libyan author, nonetheless, they you know, promoted it in Oman, and publishing a journal of Tafahum, and of course they also have this traveling exhibit on religious tolerance in Oman. So, and all of which is quite valid. So what then does this mean to Ibadi identity? Now, of course, we all know our friend, His Excellency Sheikh Abdullah Salmi, and I was fortunate in January 2013 to be in a session with him with Professor Yahya Michaud of Harvard Seminary, who asked Sheikh Salami about Ibadism. And Sheikh Salami replied, and I asked his permission to quote him. This is why I wanted to talk to him on that first day. I want to make sure I didn't misquote him, want to make sure that there wouldn't be a problem if I did quote him. But he said, the Ibadism of Oman is different from Ibadism elsewhere because we are people of the sea. Now, I found this absolutely fascinating because from the words of the grandson of Nuruddin Salami, who was not one of the people of the sea, but one of the people of the interior. And I think it just shows the extent to which thinking about the rest of the world has changed. So I think I had best stop at this point. I've gone over. You have all been wonderfully patient, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoffman, and let me introduce to you our next speaker, Professor Aman Ghazal from the university, from the Dalhousie University. And the presentation is entitled Science, Education and Anti-Colonialism, an Ibadi project of reform in the interwar period. So, please.
Thank you. Thanks. So, speaking of Bahlani, in 1915, Nasr al-Bahlani, an Omani alim in Zanzibar, sent a letter to the Imam in Oman, Salim al-Kharousi, advising him on several matters.
Yes, okay.
An urgent one that required the Imam's attention, Bahlani advised, was the need to open more schools for Omani pupils and provide them with a good education, because Oman, quote unquote, is horribly weakened due to ignorance. Bahlani asked the Imam to cover the cost from the public treasury and from donations provided by will of Omanis. He reminded him that advanced nations that modernized and developed were able to do so due to government's intervention, and thus the Imam's intervention was needed if Oman were to overcome its weakness, partially caused by lack of a good educational system. Bahlani did not elaborate much on the details of the education needed, but considered religious sciences to be the core of what he called an urgently needed scientific nahda al-ilmi. Like other Ibadis at the time, the Bahlani came to see the Ibadi Nahda as part of the general Nahda in the Mashriq, one that endorsed a scientific Nahda. Bahlani's advice on a curriculum that engages with the scientific Nahda was part of a broader trend among the Ibadi reformers and started similar initiatives. In 1914, Zabi reformers sent the first student mission to Tunisia. The goal was to provide a well-rounded education for Zabi students, blending religious sciences at Zaytuna with natural sciences at the Turbuniya, a type of education missing in French Algeria. The mission was interrupted by the events of the First World War, resumed in 1917 and expanded in the interwar period. Bahlani's advice to the Imam did not materialize in anything concrete, but when Suleiman al-Baruni served as an advisor to the Imam in the 1920s, he worked toward setting up a modern school in the town of Samani. Like the Mzabi missions, his endeavor faced much opposition by conservative Ibadis, in this case of the Imami, who fought the idea of a modern curriculum. While the Mzabi student missions were successful and surmounted criticism, Baruni's project did not, and the modern school in the Imamate remained an unfinished project. In the meantime, Omanis in Zanzibar were fighting their own battle to assert the importance of a modern curriculum. But their battle was not so much with conservative elements within the community, but with the British administration. This paper looks at the project of educational reform sponsored and propagated by the Mzabis and by the Omanis in Zanzibar during the interwar period. Ibadi reformers in Egypt, Tunisia, and Zanzibar were part of a global network of Muslim reformers who were arguing for the need of a modernist interpretation of Islam as a means of self-empowerment and as a much-needed step to bring colonialism to an end. In this context of this modernist interpretation, they promoted a modern education that integrated natural sciences, foreign languages, and religious sciences into one curriculum. But that necessitated also a battle on two fronts. One with those whom reformers called obscurantists, holding Muslim progress back, and one with the colonial order. I'll first look at the Mzabi case and the arguments made against conservatives opposed to a modern education, and then at the Zanzibari case to illustrate the struggle against the colonial order in the case of Zanzibar. In the first instance, I look at two booklets published in 1923, one by Ibrahim Abul Yaqdan and another by Ibrahim Al-Fiyash, with the purpose of refuting the arguments of the conservative Ibadi who had attacked those missions. And that attack was published in 1923 under the title Kashf al-Mutam Aghrad Ba'd al-Li'am by Salih bin Omar al-Ali. Abul Yaqdan saw the student mission to Tunisia as part of the general Nahda Amma, witnessed in the region, and like al-Bahlani before him, he considered it a specifically scientific Nahda al-Ilmiya, one that was nevertheless facing opposition by those called obscurantists. Explaining the rationale behind setting up the missions, he stated that they were necessitated by exposure to the world's material and literary advances and by the connections forged among peoples and nations in this new global order. But the Mzabis, he said, were bit by bit loosening the ties to old norms as part of their social progress, and were spreading out in the lands to earn money and help the barren Zab. This connects to Augustine's thought in terms of this awareness of the Zabis now becoming a diaspora, seeking livelihood, trading, etc. However, he said this was not possible without education and knowledge. And since going back to simplicity was not an option any longer, and since the Mzabis could not afford to be left unarmed with knowledge, reformers decided to send students to schools that offer a modern education. So, I mean, these are fascinating booklets, by the way. We can see lots of things in them. And what we see here is this early reference to global order and the changes in the economy, the changes on the societies, in travel patterns, etc., and the effects they were having on the Mzabis. And, you know, this urgency for the Mzabis to engage with what was going on. And there, according to Abu Yaqdan, at the missions in Tunisia, Mzabi students learned religious and natural sciences, and as a result became enlightened and their minds broadened. And of course, we're going to see a lot of reference to kind of the 19th and 20th century terms of civilization, progress, enlightenment, etc. And it's very fascinating to see someone like Abu Yaqdan and of course deeply engaging with those terms and their meanings. Reformers' goal was thus to renew the lives of nations and to catch up to human progress, merging the new with the old. And thus the mission was in opposition to that of the Mursidun, who were against anything new and against modern progress, who believed that the old is righteousness and the new is corruption and kufr. Both the language used by Abu Yaqdan as well as the arguments she put forward showed the extent to which Ibadi reformers had were integrated in the modernist religious movement, Harakat al-Islam, and how kind of engaged they were with this whole vision of progress versus stagnation, a very powerful discourse by the reformers at the time. Abu Yaqdan argued that it was with those sciences shunned by conservatives that Islam spread across the, or had spread across the world and established its rule, and that Europe was indebted to Muslims for those sciences. He reminded his readers that Europe owes Islam its civilization, and that it is with those sciences that Europe was fighting Islam, had been conquering the lands of Muslims, and enslaving them. If adopting those sciences enabled Europeans to conquer Muslims, Muslims shunning sciences were further contributing to the weakening of Muslims and stripping them of all power. And thus, those who opposed those sciences were traitors to their countries and to their religion. Now, the author itemized what he considered essential sciences that needed to be endorsed by Muslims: political science, history, geography, mathematics, engineering, chemistry, biology, foreign languages, and astronomy. And for those of us who have been writing on the polemics between reformers and conservatives, especially the issue of foreign languages, as indicated, was key to the battle between reformers and conservatives. In an indication of the body's belonging to a broader discourse on reform, Abu Yaqdan quoted Muhammad Abdu on how abandoning sciences contradicted Quranic teachings and further weakened Muslims and kept them unprepared for the ongoing confrontation with Europe. In any way, sciences lead to a better knowledge of God, according to Abdu, whose existence cannot be proven by theoretical arguments only, but also by facts that these sciences reveal. And again, Abu Yaqdan's extensive reference to Abdu in that booklet shows how broadly contested the whole project of modern education was at the time, and the extent to which polemics between reformers and conservatives centered around the nature of education Muslims should or should not be getting. And I have to say, having worked for years on these issues, we haven't yet provided work and we haven't given much attention to the conservatives so that we understand the nature of these polemics. We know more about the defense of the arguments put forward by the reformers. We know less about the arguments put forward by the conservatives. He also quoted abundantly from Abu Hamid al-Ghazali on the meaning of ilm and to refute the conservatives' arguments that modern education was a bid'ah. And I've noticed that referring to Ghazali is very common among the audience in the late 19th century, to convince his readers and his opponents that religious sciences and natural ones cannot be separated from each other, he referred to ulama who believed that even jurisprudence was from the science of dunya. Ulum al-dunya wa ulum al-deen. So, he was referring to some ulama who were saying fiqh belongs to ulum al-dunya and not to ulum al-deen. The author then goes on refuting the conservatives' arguments one by one with detailed criticism of concepts and terms used by his opponent in an effort to show how divergent they were from the true essence of Islamic teachings. Now, Atfiyah's arguments in his booklet are not different from those of Abu Yaqdan. I have to say Atfiyah's arguments are more interesting than Abu Yaqdan's. And if you read that treatise he wrote, it really deserves at least an MA thesis. The way, the terminology he uses, the arguments he uses, it's a fascinating piece. That Abu Yaqdan Atfiyah referred to the Sahaba as a generation who adopted and defended natural sciences and should thus be emulated by Muslims. Those who opposed natural sciences were not following, of course, the example of the Sahaba, were neglecting the works of the mind and ignoring facts, were a burden and in the way of progress and practical life for Muslims. They are a divisive element opposed to those with wisdom and resemble in their behavior and beliefs barbaric nations in the pre-Islamic period, and thus they have nothing of the, of Islamic teachings and what they believe. They go against the spirit of Islam. He reminded his readers that awakening among Muslims relies on a strong and sincere will that can defeat the opposition of the Rajideen. And the Mufsideen, Rajideen, all those terms used to describe the conservatives are very implicit. And all parties of reform were under attack by those who preferred isolation or sought their own interests and opposed reform only to bring attention to themselves. And in that particular paragraph, it shows that Fiyash knows very well that this is not the case of Zad or the bodies he's talking about the general Islam. But he also reminded his readers that knowledge has always defeated ignorance, and that the circle of knowledge and of sciences has been broadened since the dawn of Islam. Of course, what he's doing here is saying it's with the coming of Islam that sciences flourished in the world, and this is kind of the starting point. He gave the example of the early generation of Muslims who invested in sciences until the Muslim nation flowered, spread, and conquered others, and who did not shy away from commenting on and elaborating on the sciences of previous nations. They did so for the sake of honoring and advancing Islam. But according to him, a comparison between the present and the past reveals how things have changed, and with the gap now between Muslims and others, with the latter having sciences and scientists affecting their lives at all levels, while Muslims are still in need of even something as trivial as a sewing needle that needs to be imported. While Atfiyash sees faith in Islam and knowledge in Islamic sciences as a starting point, he asserts that those alone are not enough to understand Islam and to be good, like a proper Muslim. So, again, like other reformers, he was saying religious sciences are very important, very essential, but on their own, they don't make you a good Muslim. You do need natural sciences to be a good Muslim. And the frame of all of this is how Muslims have become weak, they don't have resources, particularly with the hand of Europeans, but there's always the reminder that the Europeans owe this to the sciences developed by earlier Muslims. The first science Atfiyash defended was philosophy, whose absence from the curriculum he lamented, and which he considered to be one of the most honorable subjects. That's the key to knowledge. And I think this is one of the most fascinating defense of philosophy in the early 20th century. Because again, this whole issue of teaching and learning philosophy, especially in the Sunni world, by then had become a very contested issue. And this is a thing, I'm not an expert on this particular topic, but whoever works on philosophy will find this to be very interesting given the time period. So it's a key to knowledge, insight. It's an insight into the secrets of the universe that God had asked us to find. The philosophy he defends, he reminds his readers, is not that of corrupt faith in religion and denouncing it, but rather it's the useful knowledge that corresponds to the verse, he grants wisdom to whom he pleases, and whoever is granted wisdom, he indeed is given a great good. He divides philosophy into two categories, falsafat al-ilahiyat and falsafat al-qadriyat. The latter includes geology, physiology, histology, bacteriology, and other sciences. Many of those who study those sciences see in them divine miracles that ultimately lead them to believe in God. Atfiyash reminds his readers that the present time witnessed one of the most vicious tribulations represented by the assault of Europe on the East, sharp at the time. That was a very common term. While Muslims neglected their duties and abandoned sciences, thus reviving sciences, and by this means natural sciences, was essential. The sciences that should be learned are history, which he called the art of history, a very elegant way of describing the sciences. So I just say a few things about history and geography. So history in a nutshell offers lessons to be learned by Muslims, as the Quran does when it tells stories of previous nations. That's why we want Muslims to study history as a science. Muslims can learn from history how to follow the history path by learning from the mistakes of previous generations. فن الجغرافيا. For him, this is crucial in an interconnected world that we know each other. It's also important for those who need to seek knowledge, as the previous generations of Muslims did, and for those who are in trade. They need to know geography as well. Geography also for him serves a political purpose for him as an embodiment, as it allows, as the Muslim and as an embodiment, it allows for Muslims to meet and eliminate any misunderstanding among them for the sake of unity. So he finds it shameful not to know where Oman, Zanzibar, and Istanbul are located. So I mean, the choice of Oman, Zanzibar, and Istanbul is very interesting here, right? The other sciences he wants Muslims to learn are engineering, physics, chemistry, botany, math, foreign languages, composition, psychology, and measurements. So I'll stop here and move a little bit to the Omanis in Zanzibar. I won't elaborate much because I wrote a chapter in my book on this particular issue. I want to compare and contrast here. Now, for the Omanis in Zanzibar, education was at the heart of a national project to preserve the Arabo-Islamic identity of Zanzibar under colonial rule. Like in Zabs, there was a need for natural sciences as well as religious ones. But it was a more complicated matter in Zanzibar. Education was at the heart of a power struggle between different groups, especially between the Omani ruling elite and the British. While the British used the education system to further stratify the Zanzibar society along ethnic and socioeconomic lines, Omanis used it for two main goals. One, to try and preserve the Arab Islamic identity of the island, and the other is to try and prepare Arabs and Swahilis for the new colonial economy and the global order. Unlike the Mzabis in the war period, who were debating the nature of the private communal education, like the student missions, the contestation in Zanzibar was over the nature of the public education being offered. Now, the most outspoken critics of the public educational system in Zanzibar were the Omanis, who, like the Mzabis discussed above, were also from the reformist camp. The matter was of such an utmost importance for them that they found it urgent to create a public platform to discuss this. And it's for this purpose, partially, that the Omanis launched in 1928 the newspaper Al-Falaq. According to the editors of Al-Falaq, the reason behind the publication of Al-Falaq in the first place was the need to discuss the state of education in Zanzibar. And the state of public education in Zanzibar was rarely absent from the weekly discussions on the pages of Al-Falaq. The editors and contributors to Falaq were convinced that the current educational system was a threat not only to the identity of the island, but also to its own future and that of its Arab inhabitants more specifically. Now, Omanis in Zanzibar did not have to face pressure from conservatives at the same level that the Mzabis had in the war period, but from the colonial order itself, that the Omanis believed was undermining them as an ethnic group and as a class, and undermining the status of Arabic and Islam on the island. The stakes were high, as the fate of Zanzibar, according to Omanis, hinged on the nature of education offered in the public schools. The battle for them was different from that of the Mzabis in the sense that it was not a matter of including natural sciences in the curriculum, but actually it's about elevating the status of Arabic and Islamic curriculum. So the issue was not whether the students should learn natural sciences, that's what was taken care of. The issue was where is Islam or Islamic education in the curriculum, and where is the Arabic language? So to do so, they ask for a better integration of Arabic and Islamic education into the curriculum to attract more students. So one can have a number of observations and conclusions on the importance of education for the Ibadi reformers in the interwar period. One can discuss education as perhaps one of the most important sites to implement the reformist project and to shape the future of Muslim societies. One can also talk about the relationship between education and the formation of nationalist identities. We know how much Omanis invested in education as being essential to their nationalist vision, defining Zanzibar as being Arab and Muslim. The type of education Mzabis received in Tunisia shaped their engagement with the nationalist project in Nigeria. But what I want to talk a bit about here relates to the theme of this conference, the Ibadi diaspora. As I commented yesterday in an informal discussion about the theme of the conference, Arab or Ibadi is the diaspora. But for the sake of time and the purpose of the paper, I focus on the Ibadi diaspora in the context of the 20th century. The Mzabis who had to disperse and seek a livelihood outside of the Mzab, and to whom Abu Yaldan referred, were a diaspora whose condition partially urged Abu Yaldan to argue for the necessity of armed presence with a modern education. The student missions in Tunis were also a diaspora in a sense, as were the Omanis in Zanzibar, if we define the diaspora in terms of the original homeland. So I'm using it in a very generic way. One characteristic of the Ibadi diaspora is that it was almost exclusive of the reformist. It was almost exclusively reformist, as Augustin also mentioned, the connection between merchants, traders, and reformers. So if you look at the Ibadi diaspora, in terms of what I'm discussing here, they were all reformists. Even before the 1920s, 1930s, Ibadis in the diaspora, in Egypt, for example, or in Tunisia, were integrated into the broader Islamic networks that advocated the modernization of knowledge. That was a condition and a product of the diaspora experience. The Ibadi diaspora was largely cosmopolitan, more or less, exposed to new ideas and current intellectual trends. So perhaps it was the diaspora condition that enabled Ibadis to effect changes outside of the original locality, where they faced more opposition or challenges. The Mzabis had more room and freedom in Tunisia to implement their visions than they had in the Mzab, and the same can be said about our Zanzibar. In both cases, it was the diaspora returning to the original homeland who shaped the educational system, where the Mzabis returning in the 1930s to the Mzab, for Omanis were rather forced in this case in the 1960s onwards, going back to Oman and being kind of leaders in establishing the new educational system, especially under Sultan Qaboos. So we see here the diaspora was playing a role in those specific points as well, the education. Now, and in both cases, the return signaled a major shift in the battle between reformers and conservatives, with the reformers shaping the nature of national education. I mean, once we go beyond the 1940s and the 1950s and the nation states of the educational systems, and we look at those behind establishment of curriculum, we look at their background, those particular reformist camps. And not just in Nigeria and Oman, but almost in every Arab country. Conservatives disappear completely from the picture, marginalized, and then the reformers are taking care of this business. Whether the type of education they had been passionately advocating has solved any of the dilemmas and issues that triggered the articulation and definition of the modern curriculum is often for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of interesting questions for the discussion if we still have time. But anyway, now let me introduce you Kimberly Wortman, right from the Religious Department, the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Harvard, PhD candidate. And the title of your presentation is the religious activism in Oman and beyond, the case of Istiqama charitable society. So that is the change in the program in terms of the title of the presentation.
Yeah, so I decided to change the title because I was thinking more about Oman this past semester because I went to Oman in December and did a little bit of research on this community that I study in Zanzibar. And while the majority of my field work was conducted in Zanzibar and on mainland Tanzania, I thought it was sort of interesting. It would be interesting to kind of try to understand better sort of the role that this community of Istiqama that I'll talk about plays in Oman, where they're headquartered, and to see to what degree sort of religious discourse that emerges in Oman and is sort of produced by these actors in Oman is transmitted abroad to Zanzibar. So that's sort of the reason for this change. So before I begin, I'd like to thank the Ministry of Awqaf and also the Tokyo University for hosting this event. And echoing what Amanda said a couple of days ago, I feel really humbled as a graduate student to be included in the discussion and to have the opportunity to present my work. And it's really also very humbling to follow, these giants, Valerie Hoffman and Amal Rizal, because I've benefited so much from their work over the past years, in particular on the intellectual history of Zanzibar and its relationship to Oman. And I think a lot more work needs to be done in this area. So I'm been very impressed by what they've produced. So I'll begin. The title of my presentation is Ibadi Religious Activism in Oman and Beyond, the case of the Istiqama Charitable Society. And so the image here, just to give some explanation, is the Al-Khalili Mosque, Friday Mosque on Pemba Island. And Pemba is north of Unguja, and it's actually kind of pretty close to Kenya, but still part of Tanzania. So it's a separate island, but still part of Zanzibar. And the reason I decided to show this image is because it's sort of a good example of the work that Istiqama is doing in the region. And they built several of these congregational mosques to really sort of provide the practice of congregational prayers amongst the Ibadis in the region. Because prior to sort of the development of Istiqama, this practice hadn't really existed within the Ibadi community. And so I thought that this was a good example. Okay, so to begin, in 1995, members of the Sultanate of Oman's Muscat-based and largely Swahili-speaking Ibadi Muslim community established the main headquarters of the Istiqama International Charitable Society. And this is their emblem that they circulate in a lot of their WhatsApp and internet ads. The formation of this charity in Oman coincided with the establishment of its largest sub-branch in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And so here's Tanzania, and you can see, it's not the best map, but you can see Unguja in the south, the main island, and then Pemba in the north that I referred to. And so the mosque that I showed you is in Chake Chake town, which is the southern capital of Pemba, but it's not represented there. There's a second Istiqama branch in the north in Wete. So the sub-branch was established in Dar es Salaam, and this led to the proliferation of branches of Istiqama across East Africa. So almost all the major cities in Tanzania and Zanzibar have branches of Istiqama, and many of these branches have Friday mosques and schools. And so in this paper I show that as a self-proclaimed non-governmental organization, Istiqama plays an important role in shaping and transmitting a distinct dialogue about Islam and social welfare within the Sultanate and abroad, especially in many African countries, such as Tanzania, Congo, Uganda, and Burundi. And so these are countries that have significant Omani populations that sort of developed through trade in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so again, we're sort of reviving some of these networks that we've already discussed, especially on the last panel, and in Sufyan's, these migratory sort of patterns and associations that develop. Istiqama does this through a number of charitable and Islamic outreach initiatives, dawah, such as the building of mosques and schools, and hosting informal study groups and lectures in its various centers and institutes. From its base in Muscat, Istiqama sets much of its international policy on religious matters and draws heavily from Omani national discourses that are centered on the relationship between religious tolerance, and Ibadi Islam in Oman, as well as the Islamic obligation towards charitable giving. So one of the arguments that I make is that dawah and charitable giving are very closely related and important sort of for this group's identity. So this paper focuses on the self-representation of Istiqama in Oman and its efforts to spread dawah among foreign visitors to the Sultanate. The focus will be on the nature of Istiqama's outreach at the Islamic Center, which is housed at the Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque in the Baushara district of Muscat. So this is Istiqama, Tanzania, but I should have shown that earlier, but here's the mosque. Okay. These dawah initiatives appear to be largely women-led and reflect a division of labor in Istiqama between the grassroots activism and charity work of its women volunteers and the more top-down approach of its male leadership, who tend to mobilize support for Istiqama's projects on an institutional level. So on all the ads for Istiqama, you'll see sort of the names of the male leadership and a lot of sort of the funding on an institutional level is done by the men. But the women are very much involved in the grassroots movement and sort of mobilizing local communities and other women towards these efforts. Moreover, many of the Istiqama volunteers are among the Swahili-speaking Omanis who were either born in East Africa or are children of Omani parents who left the region following the economic and political hardships in the post-independent period in Eastern Africa. And so it's sort of circa 1960 to 1965, but there were some migrations earlier as well. As a largely East African and especially Zanzibari Omani initiative in Oman, Istiqama is an important example of the form of nonprofit Ibadi and Omani charities and religious organizations that have developed in the contemporary period. So in its self-representation, Istiqama describes its mission as calling Muslims to the faith, dawah, and spreading the faith, tabligh, to all people, and at the same time advocating for people to treat each other with compassion. In its official publications, Istiqama emphasizes a policy of non-discrimination. And I quote, "The association does not lean in only one direction. It does not distinguish people based on color, except the color of Islam and charitable work." And I think in a multi-ethnic and sort of multicultural organization, this is a particularly poignant point and policy to assert. Istiqama further stresses a commitment to overcoming sectarian divisions and disharmony in Oman and its areas of influence abroad, and it selects its volunteers and members based on their reputations for being virtuous and upright members of society. Istiqama claims to play an important role in the provision of social services and moral support within marginalized or peripheral communities at home and abroad. So it's much easier in my experience to trace sort of their influence in Tanzania, partially because I spent a lot of time there, but also because the institutions are very clear. I mean, the mosques, some of them will have names that are closely associated with Ibadi figures. And the schools, some of them will be called Istiqama schools. So there's sort of a more tangible presence in Tanzania. In Oman, I found it a little more difficult to sort of trace their institutional presence. So in his contribution to a book titled, or a multi-volume work titled The Role of Oman in the Unity of the Ummah, Istiqama Sheikh Zahir al-Alawi explains, and I quote, "The community's works are distinguished by their efficiency and quick response to existing demands, which include keeping abreast of the state of Muslim members of this organization. Volunteers conduct periodic visits to find out how their members are, and to keep in touch with the citizens about their needs, as well as making sure that the foreign branches of the association run smoothly. Of particular concern to Istiqamah is the education of Muslim students and ensuring the awareness and adherence to the principles of the Quran through the celebration of those who memorize the Holy Book, in addition to providing opportunities for higher education that will enable them to lead upright lives, end quote. Istiqamah further emphasizes its proximity to local communities, as you mentioned, and their commitment to both the implementation and sustainability of their various projects. And this is made possible by the person-to-person approach of volunteers in the distribution of aid and the dissemination of religious education. Many of these volunteers in Oman are retirees, or they work full-time as business people, homemakers, or government employees. And according to its members, Istiqamah is among the leading organizations engaged in Dawah in Oman. The community has established centers where visitors can go and inquire about Islam. And the most prominent of these is at the Islamic Center at the Sultan Qaboos Mosque. And so this is, the mosque is, as I think many of you know and have probably visited, is centrally located along the Sultan Qaboos Highway, about 10 kilometers from the airport. So the construction of the Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque in Muscat began following an international design competition initiated in 2001. The mosque opened in 2001 and has since become one of the most popular tourist destinations and sites of worship in Muscat for both men and women. Oman's Ministry of Tourism describes the Grand Mosque as follows. It's close to the road leading to the heart of the capital, Muscat, and it's in the Wilayat Baushad, so the Baushad district. And it's like a radiant lighthouse, attracting its visitors to interact with the spirit of Islam as a religion, science, and civilization. This mosque highlights its role as a scientific and intellectual source of knowledge across the Islamic world, end quote. The ministry here characterizes the mosque as a beacon of light which guides the lost traveler or the seeker of knowledge in need of spiritual and intellectual sustenance. The lighthouse metaphor further suggests that knowledge about Islam emanates from Oman outwards, imagining Oman as the center of Islamic learning and enlightenment. The Islamic Center at the Grand Mosque is a great example of this, and it was founded in 2002. It's an important, it operates sort of on a multilingual basis, as a lot of the volunteers, come from a lot of different backgrounds and speak multiple languages. And so it's not uncommon to hear a mix of Arabic, Swahili, Somali, and in addition to a number of European languages. As one of the women volunteers, Sanan, and Yusuf was here, explained during my last visit to the Grand Mosque, the timing of the Islamic Center's establishment just after 9/11 wasn't coincidental, nor was the decision to incorporate this space into the Grand Mosque complex, which was the only mosque open to tourists. Following the media onslaught of Muslims in Islam in the early 2000s, in addition to the apparent curiosity of foreigners visiting the mosque, the Istiqamah leadership felt the need to develop a mitigating presence in the Gulf that would help to educate and improve the image of Islam held by non-Muslims and non-Arabs who were visiting this region, which is often viewed as ridden with sectarian conflict. They appealed to the Omani government to allow them to run a Dawah center at the mosque in cooperation with the Ministry of Al-Awqaf and in line with the Sultanate's guidelines for the establishment of religious institutions and religious discourse in Oman. Upon arrival at the center, the visitor removes his or her shoes before entering an intimate and flesh-covered space. And again, I'm sure many of you have been to the center. To the right of the entryway is a shelf full of pamphlets about Islam in various European and Asian languages, which indicates a well-defined target audience and visitor base. The center began to publish and provide translations of these materials after noticing a deficiency in basic literature on Aqidah, Salat, Tafsir, and Tafsir of the Quran in non-Arabic languages. To the left of the main majlis is the plush Omani-style seating area, which consists of a rectangular room lined with long couches. And in the center are coffee tables supporting trays of delicious dates and traditional Omani coffee pots and cups. Volunteers stand ready to serve coffee and dates, and they answer queries and distribute the complimentary books and pamphlets. And so when asked about the types of questions that are posed to them, Sana, my interlocutor, leader, responded, they usually ask things like, why do you cover? Why do men wear white and women wear black? And why are there special places for men and women to pray? And also, from a Hindu people, why don't you pray to statues? The volunteers respond to these questions by explaining the Islamic position on the given issue. And in the interest of generating dialogue, they often make comparisons to cultures that are more familiar to the primarily non-Arab and non-Muslim visitors. The center acts as a welcoming space for those seeking to learn more about Islam in a relaxed environment, as well as a support system for new converts. Tourists visiting the center come from all over the world, as I mentioned, and they're able to sort of communicate with volunteers, through this multilingual skill that they have. And they're free to ask questions about really anything from terrorism to why Muslim women wear veils. And apparently these are among the most popular questions, and also unfortunately perhaps. The center also offers bi-weekly classes for the study of the Quran and fiqh for new Muslims and for those who are considering conversion to Islam. And so Sana explains, and I quote, "From time to time after reading, they come to us and say they have decided to become Muslim. In the beginning, there are about 20 to 40 visitors per year who would convert, and later the numbers would increase. Many are from the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and fewer come from the US and Europe. And some of the tourists have been reading and then decide to take the Shahada. Some have been searching within themselves, and then they come to us and need more help and guidance. The large number," and I end quote, "the large number of Southeast Asian converts at the center raises questions about the relationship between domestic labor in Oman and religious practice. As is the case elsewhere in the Gulf, the majority of the domestic and extra-governmental labor force in Oman is foreign and largely South and Southeast Asian. Domestic workers tend to arrive primarily from the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and elsewhere, and many start their careers as nannies or housekeepers from an early age. A sizable number, though not all of these domestic workers, are non-Muslim women who find little space or opportunity to practice their own beliefs or to engage socially in an Arabo-Islamic context in which one's dress, daily schedule, and movements are largely influenced by Islamic principles of propriety and practice. Moreover, a lack of sufficient finances in the kafala system that limits the freedoms of migrant laborers across the Gulf states complicate a foreign worker's ability to maintain community connections with family members back home and others of similar backgrounds in Oman. For those non-Muslims destined to live and work in the Gulf for most of their lives, conversion to Islam is one means of better integrating into society, reluctant to integrate its foreign workforce into its larger social structure." Excuse me. The women's branch of Istiqama International in many ways drives the Dawah movement in Oman, and much, or at least, within the Istiqama's activities, and much of the organization's in-country fundraising charity work. The group began as an informal community of Ibadi women who would meet periodically to discuss issues of importance to them and to the community at large. Several members of this group have African roots and were born abroad in some of the countries that I mentioned before, and they were raised speaking one or more of the languages of those countries in addition to Arabic. And some of them are more comfortable in the African languages than they are in Arabic. The members of this group, okay, thank you. That's all right. The members of this group with whom I met at the mosque, for example, communicate amongst themselves in, dialects of Arabic, mirroring the mode of communication in many households in Oman. Among the founders of the women's group is Farah, again a pseudonym, a small and vivacious Omani woman of European descent. She explains that the Istiqama Women's Group in Oman began as a periodic and informal community gathered that included around 10 women. The women began to meet with the leadership of the older and more established men's group to discuss playing a more formal role in the community and its organization. Among the women's interlocutors was Sheikh Zahra, who clarified the goals of the organization as a non-governmental charitable society dedicated to the support of the poor and the destitute and to activating the role of Oman and abroad. The Istiqama Sheikhs also emphasized that while Istiqama is non-governmental, it operates according to the Sultan's Diwan or cabinet and the laws of the country. Farah says that with the blessing of Sheikh Zahra, the women began to meet in her house, and the house became a friendly space, and here she uses baked blood. for educating women on Islam and their role in the Dawah movement. She explains that she initially played the role of teacher, mudarrisa, and missionary Muhammad, with the goal of stimulating a kind of re-entry of the Ugabi women's community into Islam. Istiqama's women volunteers are the most active at the center, yet their role in coordinating public dawah activities is a recent development. Farah explains that women formally disengage from dawah activities beyond the home, as addressing the broader or the foreign community and Jaliyat is the men's prerogative, and the women operated under, she says, under the umbrella of the men. As such, the women volunteers initially focused their energies on community outreach initiatives such as building houses for the poor, providing iftar meals during the month of Ramadan, and clothing Eid, as well as supporting students and orphans. The women became increasingly more active in Istiqama's seasonal works, and its members and membership grew. In time, the women began delivering lectures around the country, and she says from the perspective of dawah, and they became increasingly more involved in religious outreach to foreigners. All with the cooperation, she says, with the Ministry of Al-Haq. But I'm still trying to work out what exactly is the relationship between Istiqama and the Ministry of Al-Haq. So if anybody has any insights on that, I would much appreciate it. The multilingual and multicultural background of many members of Istiqama complements the sort of unified message that's disseminated by the ministry. According to Sanat, the Istiqama women's volunteers play a leading role in grassroots activism and community building. And she says, and I quote, "Women are really working hard, especially in fundraising. Ladies are more into charitable work than men. Men do work, but women do more. I think it has to do with the social life of women and their role in organizing lectures. In Islam, women are not responsible for anything financially. That is, they don't have to spend their money. Men, on the other hand, have lots of expenditures. Women can help financially, for example, in building a home, and some men, and some of them do help with family expenses, but the majority do not. So you, as a woman, can spend your money on an expensive car, or you can give it to charity. Men go to the big organizations to request funding, whereas women go to more, do this on a more local level." End quote. So I'm just going to skip the rest of it, but I think that quote is sort of a good example of this division of labor that exists with it, at least for the perspective of the women within the organization, and sort of they work in tandem with each other. But I have sort of a whole analysis of the gender dynamics, but there's not really time for that.
So the first presentation went a little bit over. Could we just skip the discussion time and allow her to finish?
Sorry, but we have just got the information from the organizer that we cannot be too late, and I must complete the session at 2 sharp. So we have 10 minutes.
Yeah, but can we skip the discussion as well?
We started late, so please address the organizers. That is the information I
Yes,
should.
but can we stop at 2 o'clock?
As a timekeeper, I should follow the instructions of the organizers. We can continue discussion, in any place, in any time also. No. Please, Kimberly, you notice or...
Yeah, is there time to conclude that?
Yes.
I don't know where, really, okay. Right, okay. So, I guess I would just like to emphasize, the innovative strategies that the Istiqama Charitable Society uses to communicate its message about a tolerant and inclusive Islam to non-Muslims and foreign visitors in Oman. And I think it's particularly interesting how they do this through tourism. And it's just, I don't know if there are other examples of this, but I think that's kind of the strategy. And this includes creating safe spaces for interfaith dialogue, as well as making knowledge widely accessible by mobilizing, again, a multicultural and multilingual volunteer corps, and most of whom seem to be women, at least at the center. And the focus on Islamic education through tourism further opens up new ways of thinking about the practice of dawah and raises questions about the role of religious charities, such as Istiqama, in the representation of religion in Oman. What remains clear in my research is that the nature of the relationship between Istiqama and the state is is one that they don't want to talk about. But yet, at the same time, I think in order to kind of operate, in an Islamic center that's at, sort of this national mosque, there has to be some kind of tie there, and in particular, being allowed to represent, Islam, in a way. So, and my large dissertation project kind of examines how certain discourses, again, that are produced in Oman, through this community, are to be transmitted abroad, and then how they're renegotiated in a foreign or Zanzibari, Tanzanian context, and how discourses that emerge from that context also influence sort of the Omani, presentation or representation of Islam. So it's a two-way.
Thank you. We still have 15 minutes for the discussion as the previous sessions. So please, first of all, I would like to thank to the three giants using the words of Kimberly. Yes, and now we have got very consistent and interesting sessions in terms of topics and the intellectual approach. I think so. The floor is open to questions. Please, Dr. Hajri.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not sure if the point that I'm going to talk has been mentioned in the presentation, but because I came late. But I think it is a very problematic point when we talk about Omani nationality in Zanzibar. That is the absence of Africa in the works of Omani scholars or poets who lived there. We don't find, for example, any presence of Zanzibar or Africa in general in the huge Diwan or Divan of Abi Muslim al-Bahlani. Where is Zanzibar in the poetry of Abi Muslim? Was it a kind of nostalgia that prevented Omanis from talking about the place about Africa as a place, people, and culture? Is there any explanation for that? That's my point, and it is directed to all of you.
Since I mentioned the topic of today's nationalism is the interwar period phenomenon. You can't talk about nationalism before this. Certainly there was a very strong nationalist discourse in the century, in the interwar period, no doubt about this. Bahlani does mention Africa in one of his, he talks about Africa as actually kind of a place of diaspora for the Omanis. The place meant something else before the war, then after the war, for the generation of Bahlani, then let's say for the generation of Hashim al-Masri and so on. So you can't really just talk about continuity. There's this kind of, I don't know how to describe it, really a break between Bahlani's generation and the generation, in terms of how they associated with the space, with the place, how they defined it, and how they related.
Yes, please. No. Okay, so other comments or questions or remarks? Yes, please.
I have some questions for you. Speaking about the Istiqama, I'm curious, I know there are a number of other things. Obviously, the method of the Badi is known as, Istiqama. So this word is important for Ibadi identity in general. There's also Mektabat Istiqama, right? There's a recent, I think it's a fairly recent organization that publishes modern republications of older Ibadi texts. Is there a relationship between this? Is the libraries related to that?
Yeah, they're connected. So, and they have a bookstore also in one, but when I went there last, it was closed. So I don't know where that is, but yeah, they are related. But I haven't been able to figure out what the exact relationship is. And there's also an Istiqama TV channel that I study or like write about in my dissertation. But even that is again kind of difficult to gauge its influence because it's broadcast out of Jordan. And yet, like, all the Omanis I talk to know about it and, like always sort of reference it, and it's multilingual. So, yes, there are all these other sort of media and sources that are associated with the organization, but it's been a little bit difficult for me to trace exactly how they're connected. But as I understand it, they are.
Thank you very much. Other comments or questions, please?
So also a question for, I was curious to hear a little bit more about outside of Zanzibar and the rest of the East African coast. It would be super interesting to hear about their activity, and in particular sort of thinking about it linguistically. When they're, I mean, I know in Uganda and Congo you could be using Kiswahili, but I was interested in how does it happen linguistically, what does it look like, or are they just these branches that are out there?
Yeah, so actually I'd love to travel to those places and study that a little bit more. I have met some of the students, so there's this Mahed in Zanzibar Institute that recruits students from all over East Africa, and I met one of these students actually at the Sharia College in Muscat, because as I understand it, the Mahed in Zanzibar is sort of oh, there we go. So the Mahed recruits students from across East Africa, and primarily within Omani communities, but there are non-Omanis studying at the institute as well, but they tend to be mostly Zanzibar and Tanzanian, I think. But then when they graduate, they have the option to go on to do some higher education in Oman. And so I met one of these students from Burundi, and he said that his father, and this is usually the case, his father is Omani and was a Swahili speaker, and his mother was from Burundi, and she spoke Kirundi and Kiswahili as well. So at home they spoke Kiswahili. I think he knew some Kinyarwanda as well. And then when Kirundi. And then when he went to the Mahed, he learned more Swahili and then Arabic as well. So it's a very extensive network and very transnational.
Thank you very much. So I can't see anyone.
Well, actually, I have a point on that. If I could, sorry. I just wanted to say one thing about your comments about Ibrahim Akbayish talking about philosophy. This is actually, I don't know if it's a direct quotation, but basically Jamaluddin Afghani said that exact same thing way back in the 19th century. And so what I think is interesting is when he talked about philosophy, it seemed to me he wasn't talking about any particular philosophical system, but rather just an ability to engage in rational inquiry, scientific reasoning, things like that. Because he talks about the spirit of philosophy and how that role of the learning of technology and has had no civilizational impact on the Muslim world, he said, because they had not learned the spirit of philosophy. So I just thought I'd mention that because I think it's interesting.
I mean, certainly, but in the context of what he's discussing, he's talking more about philosophy as a discipline, you study, as a subject.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I agree, and I think so was Afghani, but not talking about like philosophy of a particular thinker.
No, in general.
So thank you very much for the presentations and for the discussion. Now it's lunchtime.
Other
No, I was actually very
Okay.